Live, free, or die. You've seen it on the license plates, right? Well, for New Hampshire, the Granite State, that is so much more than just a motto. It's really the core of its identity, an identity forged over centuries of, well, fighting for it. So today, let's dive into that story. So you gotta ask, right? What makes New Hampshire so fiercely independent? Where does that live free or die spirit actually come from? Well, it's not one single thing. It's this incredible mix of, centuries of border disputes, brutal frontier wars, being the first to jump into a revolution, and then completely reinventing itself. Let's dig in and see if we can answer that question. Okay, here's the game plan. We're going to start at the very beginning with the first colonies. Then we'll look at its time as a frontier of conflict, its leading role in the fight for independence, the state's own internal conflicts over slavery, how it reinvented its entire economy, and finally, what makes it the Granite State we know today. All right, let's head back in time. New Hampshire's story, it doesn't kick off with some grand vision of a new society. Nope. It's much more down to earth. Think fishing, think trade, all happening on this rugged piece of coastline that was frankly completely up for grabs. And things moved fast, really fast. You see here, in 1623, you've just got these first little European outposts popping up. But bam, only 6 years later, the land gets split up, and this guy, Captain John Mason, calls his chunk New Hampshire. Makes sense, he was from Hampshire in England. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. By 1641, the whole area is basically swallowed up by the jurisdiction of Massachusetts. Right from the get-go, its independence was shaky, and that set up a pretty tense relationship for a long, long time. So for the next 100 years or so, New Hampshire's history is all about struggle. It's about survival. This was the frontier, and they were constantly fighting to define their borders, to establish their own government, and just to figure out who they were, squeezed between their neighbors and, the massive empires of Britain and France. You can really see the back and forth here. For almost 40 years, they're living under the thumb of Massachusetts. Not exactly a happy marriage. Then, in 1679, the king steps in and says, okay, you're your own royal province now. Which sounds great, right? A huge step towards having their own identity. But now the king is the boss, and those fights over who owns what land, they just got even worse. And as if all that political drama wasn't enough, New Hampshire was literally on the front lines of the massive global conflict between Britain and France. Just look at this list of wars. This was a century of brutal fighting that just tore through the frontier. This constant state of war, often fought with their native Abenaki allies against them, it forged a certain kind of person, tough, self-reliant, battle-tested. And that experience, that was going to be absolutely crucial later on. So you can probably see where this is headed, right? All this history of fighting for their own patch of land, for their own identity, it created a people who were just not going to sit back and take orders from a distant king. So when the first sparks of revolution appeared, you better believe New Hampshire was ready to douse them in gasoline. And boy, did they ever. Check this out. We're talking December 1774. This is months before the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. A group of patriots, led by General John Sullivan, just straight up raids a British fort. And as you can see from his own words, they made off with everything. Gunpowder, cannons, muskets, the whole shebang. A huge haul of supplies that would be absolutely critical in the first battles of the war, possibly even at Bunker Hill. But if you want to talk about New Hampshire's biggest revolutionary moment, it's this. One word, first. They were the very first colony to break away from Great Britain and set up their own independent government. This happened in January of 1776, a full 6 months before anyone in Philadelphia signed the Declaration of Independence. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. That right there is live free or die in action. Now, we have to talk about something more complicated, because that fight for freedom, it didn't apply to everyone. Just like the other colonies, New Hampshire had a deep and, let's be honest, pretty ugly history with slavery. And the road to ending it was full of contradictions, and some really intense conflicts that showed just how divided the state was. Just read this law from 1714. It lays the reality bare. A strict 9 o'clock curfew for any Indian, Negro, or mulatto person, enslaved or servant. Slavery wasn't just present, it was legally enforced. And what's more, New Hampshire was actually a hub for smuggling enslaved people into other colonies, all because they didn't charge a tax on it. That economic incentive was just woven right into the system.
And this is what's so powerful and heartbreaking. In 1779, in the middle of the Revolution, 20 enslaved people in Portsmouth write this petition. And listen to their words. They're using the exact same arguments about freedom and natural rights that the colonists were using against the king. They were pleading for their own independence. The petition failed. And it's pretty shocking to learn that New Hampshire didn't officially get rid of slavery until 1857.
And that resistance could be incredibly violent. Get this story. In 1835, some abolitionists start one of the country's very first integrated schools, the Noyes Academy. A really progressive idea for the time. Well, the local backlash was so intense that an angry mob literally hitched up teams of oxen to the schoolhouse, dragged the entire building away, and destroyed it. I mean, you can't get a more visceral image of the violent opposition to racial equality than that. All right, so as we move into the 18 and 1900s, the fight for New Hampshire's identity changes. It becomes less about borders and more about the economy. After the Civil War, the state just explodes as an industrial powerhouse built on massive mills. But as we'll see, that boom was not going to last, and the state would have to fight to reinvent itself all over again. But first, the Civil War, and New Hampshire was all in. No unit was more famous than the Fighting Fifth. And just look at this definition. They suffered the highest number of battle-related deaths of any Union regiment in the entire war. That just tells you everything you need to know about their level of commitment and sacrifice. It's an incredible and incredibly tragic statistic. And this timeline here, it shows a total economic roller coaster. For decades, everything was about these gigantic textile mills, especially the Amoskeag mills in Manchester. When they shut down in the 30s and 40s, it was just devastating. It could have been the end of the story. But then, look what happens. A defense contractor, Sanders Associates, shows up in '52. And by the 1970s, a completely new high-tech industry is booming, basically turning the southern part of the state into a tech hub. It's an amazing story of complete collapse and then total rebirth. Which brings us pretty much up to today, to the modern Granite State. A state that's really figured out how to use its small size and that independent streak we've been talking about to have a huge, huge impact on the entire country. And you know exactly what I'm talking about. The New Hampshire primary. It's first in the nation. And because of that, every 4 years, the entire political world focuses on this one small state. Candidates have to show up, shake hands, talk to actual voters in diners. It's old school politics. And what happens there can literally make or break a presidential campaign. It gives this tiny state a massively powerful voice. So it all comes back to that central theme, doesn't it? New Hampshire's identity has always been forged in some kind of conflict, whether it was fighting Massachusetts or the French or the British, or fighting with itself over slavery, or fighting its way out of economic collapse. Today, that battleground is political. It's the primary. So the big question is, what's next? What new conflict, what new challenge is going to forge the future of the Granite State? Hey, if you thought this was interesting, we've got a whole playlist of these U.S. state histories you should definitely check out. And of course, make sure you subscribe to Notebook Summaries so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.